Chapter 1. The Silent Streets of Zavith. Zavith, a city that sprawled across the desolate, forgotten planet of Valish, was a contradiction in itself. To those who arrived with high hopes of a thriving interstellar metropolis, it offered only disillusionment. Its towering, jagged spires of gleaming metal and shimmering glass were a stark contrast to the disheveled streets beneath them. The city's upper levels, where trade and politics took place, were pristine and polished, filled with the richest of the rich from every corner of the galaxy. But beneath those towering structures lay a labyrinth of decay and neglect. The true soul of Zavith wasn't visible to outsiders, but it was here, in the forgotten alleys and deserted corners of the city, where the struggles of survival played out in silent, unacknowledged despair. And it was in these very streets that the silent tragedy of a dying alien species would unfold. The lower districts of Zavith were a place of contradiction, where the light of the upper city scarcely reached. Here, in the narrow streets and crumbling alleyways, life seemed to have lost its vibrancy. The air hung heavy with dust, a fine, almost tangible layer that settled over everything like a shroud, suffocating the vitality that once radiated from this place. It was here that the unseen, forgotten ones lingered, and it was here that the tragedy began, unfolding in slow motion, a tale written in the dust of Zavith's forgotten corners. The streets were littered with remnants of lives abandoned, bits of alien technology, broken carts, and forgotten trinkets from a time long past. No one paid attention to the scraps on the ground, no one except for those like her. A small child, her small body wrapped in tattered, once ornate fabrics, staggered through the gloom. She was small, too small for her age, her skin a dull blue-gray that marked her as a Ziltra, a race once proud and mighty. The Ziltra had been an ancient species, their empire stretching across hundreds of systems, but that was all but a memory now. They had been broken, scattered, torn apart by war and political strife, and the child was a living reminder of their fall. Her people had been subjected to countless atrocities, their numbers dwindling as they were hunted down by those who sought to erase them from history. But the child had no understanding of these grand concepts. She didn't know that her people had once stood at the pinnacle of power, nor did she care. Her small, fragile form barely seemed capable of holding itself up, and her every step was a slow, painful movement, as if each part of her body was protesting against the very idea of continuing. Her clothes ripped and stained hung loosely around her frame, offering no protection from the chill of the Valish night that crept through the narrow alleys, the cold biting at her bare skin. Her once black eyes, large and round, darted from shadow to shadow, searching desperately for anything, a morsel of food, a scrap of cloth, anything to ease the gnawing hunger that consumed her from within. The streets offered no answers. The lights that flickered from above distant, cold, uncaring cast long shadows that stretched across the ground like dark, suffocating hands. And still, the child stumbled forward, a ghost lost in a world that had abandoned her. Her legs buckled beneath her as she collapsed, her frail body hitting the cold, unforgiving ground with a dull thud. Her breath came in shallow gasps, a faint wheezing sound escaping her cracked lips as she struggled to push herself back up. Her tiny hands scraped at the dirt, but they were too weak to support her. The streets, slick with rain and dust, were no place for someone as small and broken as her. Yet, there she was, clinging to life with every desperate breath. She had been here for days, or maybe weeks, alone in this vast city, scavenging for whatever scraps she could find, doing whatever she could to survive. She had watched as others walked by, too busy, too indifferent to notice her, a child who once had a name, once had a family, but now was nothing more than a shadow. Her people had once roamed the stars, but now, the Ziltra were nearly extinct, their cities long destroyed, their people scattered to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. The child had been left behind, abandoned by the remnants of her species, lost in the rubble of Zavith's forgotten streets. And now, as she lay there, her breath growing fainter, the weight of isolation seemed to crush the last of her will to live. It was in this moment, as her vision blurred and her senses began to fade, that she heard the sound of footsteps, a steady, rhythmic sound that grew louder as it drew nearer. Her heart, already weak, seemed to skip a beat as she tried to lift her head, her weak eyes focusing on the figure that approached. It was a human, a man, dressed in simple clothes that looked out of place in the city's sterile upper levels. He moved slowly, deliberately, his gaze scanning the streets as though searching for something. When he saw her, lying there in the dirt, his expression shifted from one of detached curiosity to something else, something that hinted at recognition. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel as he knelt down beside her. His presence was calming, a strange contrast to the chaos that surrounded them, and for a moment, the child thought that perhaps, just maybe, she had been seen at last. The man didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, his brow furrowing in quiet concern as he reached out a hand, gently brushing the hair from her face. His fingers were warm, a stark contrast to the cold that had seeped into her bones. She wanted to move, to speak, to beg for help, but the strength to do so had long since left her. Her body, frail and broken, refused to cooperate. Instead, she merely blinked up at him, her eyes too tired to fully focus, too weak to offer any hint of hope. But the man wasn't deterred. His gaze softened as he scooped her up carefully, cradling her fragile body in his arms. He was careful not to hurt her further, yet there was an undeniable strength in his movements, a determination that mirrored the unspoken promise in his eyes. The child felt a warmth she hadn't known in so long, a warmth that felt like it could reach deep into her very soul, soothing the ache of abandonment and loneliness that had haunted her for what seemed like an eternity. She didn't know why he had chosen to stop, to help her when no one else had, but in that moment, she allowed herself to relax into his embrace. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in the fragile, uncertain hope that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. The man's voice, soft but firm, broke the silence, his words directed to her, though she couldn't respond. "I'm not going to leave you here." His tone was gentle, but it carried a weight that suggested a deeper understanding, as if he had seen too many lost souls in his time. Perhaps he recognized something in her that others did not. He began walking, his steps steady as he moved away from the broken streets of Zavith, his eyes scanning the dim alleyways for any sign of danger. The child felt the warmth of his body against her own, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest offering a comfort she had long since forgotten. She didn't know where he was taking her, or what he would do once they arrived, but for the first time since her collapse, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more than just survival. There was a world out there, beyond the endless streets of Zavith, and maybe, just maybe, this human would show her what it meant to live again. And so, in the silent, cold streets of Zavith, the child began her journey not as an abandoned soul, but as someone who had been found. The man's grip was surprisingly gentle but firm, like someone who had long learned to carry weight far heavier than a frail child. He did not speak again as they moved through the narrow streets, and the child didn't have the strength to do anything but rest against his shoulder, her head barely lifting from where it had nestled into his chest. The sound of his steady breathing, the rhythmic pulse of his heart, was the only thing she focused on as the world around her seemed to blur and warp. The city, vast and indifferent, appeared to recede with each passing step, its towering buildings becoming distant silhouettes against the fading night. The scent of alien spices from the nearby food stalls, the sounds of foreign languages and metal scraping against metal, all blurred together in the child's mind until she could no longer make sense of them. It was as if she were floating in a dream, caught between the bleak reality of her existence and the hope that she might be waking from it. She had long since ceased to think beyond the immediate struggle of survival, finding food, staying hidden, evading predators. Her life had become a cycle of despair, but now, in the arms of this stranger, something began to shift within her. The cold grip of hopelessness loosened, if only slightly. There was a tenderness in the way he held her that spoke of something she had not known in a long time: care, concern, perhaps even love. The journey didn't take long, but to the child, it felt as though she had traveled light years away from her pain. She eventually lifted her head, blinking through the haze of exhaustion to see that they were approaching a small, humble building. It was nothing like the towering cityscape she had seen before, no glistening metal or pristine glass, but rather a squat, weathered structure that seemed to have endured years of hardship. There was no grandeur here, no sign of wealth, only the quiet aura of someone who had settled for simplicity. It looked like the kind of place where a person could rest without fear of being judged or hunted. The man stopped at the door and hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the child saw dim lights spilling from a flickering bulb in the corner, casting long shadows on the worn floor. The scent of something earthy, perhaps food, wafted through the air, and the warmth of the room enveloped her like a blanket. It was simple, sparse, yet it felt like a refuge, something she had not known for what seemed like an eternity. Without a word, the man carefully settled her onto a small couch in the corner. The fabric beneath her was soft compared to the cold streets she had endured, and she shivered as the warmth began to seep into her exhausted limbs. The man moved away quickly, rummaging through a small cupboard before returning with a bowl of what smelled like warm broth. He knelt beside her, his face a mix of concern and quiet determination. "Here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Try to drink this. It'll help you feel better." The child's lips parted slightly, but the effort of even lifting her hand to hold the bowl seemed like too much. She stared at it for a moment, her eyes blurry with weariness, before her body instinctively responded. Her parched throat tightened, but she managed to sip the broth, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. The liquid was thick and comforting, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her hunger began to recede. The warmth in her belly offered her a moment of peace, a quiet surrender to the kindness she had not expected. The man didn't rush her, allowing her time to finish the bowl at her own pace. He sat there quietly, watching over her, his presence a calming force in the otherwise empty room. The child, though still weak, found herself grateful for the silence. There was no pressure, no hurry, just the steady, reassuring rhythm of the man's breathing and the soft crackle of the fire in the corner. When the last drop was gone, the man set the bowl aside and stood. He walked to the nearby bed and retrieved a blanket, which he laid gently over her as she lay back, her eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion. "You'll be safe here," he murmured, almost to himself. "No one will hurt you." For the first time in ages, the child allowed herself to close her eyes fully, the deep sense of trust in the man's words taking root in her heart. She drifted off to sleep, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, there was no fear of what might come. She was not alone. Chapter 2, The Quiet Stranger. The next few days passed in a blur of softness and warmth, a stark contrast to the world she had known just days before. The man, whom she had learned was named Cade, kept his distance, never too close, never too far. He went about his days with quiet purpose, performing simple tasks, fixing things around the house, cleaning, and occasionally stepping out to run errands. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was steady and calm, always offering words of comfort, reassurance. The child, now more alert and recovering from the brink of starvation, began to notice the small things about him, how his hands moved, steady and sure as he worked, the slight furrow of his brow when he concentrated. He wasn't tall, but his frame was broad, strong in a way that hinted at a life lived in service or labor. His clothes were practical, simple, and worn, nothing grand. But it was his eyes that stood out the most, kind, yet weary, as though he carried burdens of his own, burdens he didn't speak of. Cade didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer it. It was an unspoken agreement between them. His silence matched her own. For the first time, she didn't feel the pressing need to explain, to beg for pity or recognition. He accepted her without question, as if the details of her existence didn't matter. He had offered her sanctuary, and that was enough for her. One evening, as she sat near the small window, watching the stars blink above, Cade approached. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly, his hand resting on the back of a nearby chair. The child didn't look up, instead focusing on the distant, glittering lights of Zavith's upper districts. She felt the weight of the question, as if it carried more than just concern for her health. "I'm better," she whispered. "But I don't know where I belong." Cade didn't respond immediately, but she could feel him watching her. After a long pause, he spoke again. "No one truly knows where they belong. But sometimes, we find places, or people who make us feel like we do." His words, simple as they were, struck her deeply. There was a sense of truth in them, a realization that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe this stranger, this lonely human, had unknowingly given her more than just a roof over her head. He had given her something far more valuable: hope. In the days that followed, the child began to speak more, her words slow at first, but gaining strength as time passed. Cade never pushed her to tell her story, but she found herself wanting to. And so, little by little, as the bond between them deepened, the quiet stranger became more than just a savior. He became the one who showed her that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there was a place for those left behind. As the days passed, Cade continued his routine, simple, structured, and steady. The child found comfort in his consistency. He would often spend the mornings in the small workshop at the back of the house, repairing tools or tinkering with old, discarded pieces of alien technology that he had salvaged from the streets. By afternoon, he would prepare simple meals, vegetable stews, and meats that he had hunted or bartered for. Each task was done with quiet attention to detail, and every day she watched him with growing admiration. He never once seemed impatient or frustrated, even though his life appeared to be one of hardship. There was a resilience in him that she could not help but respect. During this time, the child who had not yet shared her name slowly began to regain strength. Her body, though thin and frail, started to respond to the food and warmth that Cade provided. Her movements became less hesitant, her mind more focused. She had been so accustomed to fighting for every breath, every drop of sustenance, that to be in this place, where survival no longer felt like a constant struggle, was almost foreign to her. She wasn't used to comfort. She wasn't used to trust. Yet, in Cade's presence, she found it impossible to resist. One afternoon, as she helped him with simple chores, sweeping the dust from the floors and rearranging the cluttered shelves, Cade glanced up from his work and caught her eye. "Do you have a name?" he asked, his voice soft, but the question carrying weight. The child froze, unsure of how to answer. Her entire life had been shaped by survival, by the absence of her people, the erasure of her existence. Names were for those who had a place, a purpose, a history. She had none of those things. She was nothing more than a remnant of a lost species, the last of a race that had been erased from the galaxy. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something deep within her, something fragile, like the first breath of a dying star. "Hope." She hesitated, then whispered, "Vera." Cade nodded slowly, as if the name meant something. "Vera," he repeated softly, as if testing it on his tongue. It sounded right. "Well, Vera," he said, offering a faint smile, "I'm glad to meet you." And just like that, it was as though a new chapter of her life had begun. Her name, which she had long ago abandoned, was now a part of her again. It anchored her, made her feel more than just a survivor. For the first time, Vera began to think of herself not as the last of the Ziltra, but as someone with a future. Chapter 3: New Beginnings. Vera's life slowly transformed from a story of survival to one of quiet possibility. The simple days stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, she grew more accustomed to the rhythms of her new life. Cade, who had been a stranger just days ago, became a silent constant in her world. He was patient with her, never rushing her, never demanding anything more than she was willing to give. As the days unfolded, Vera began to realize that the loneliness she had felt for so long wasn't inevitable. It wasn't her fate to live and die alone. There was something more to life, something she hadn't seen before, something she could have, if she allowed herself to reach for it. She had been too afraid to believe in that something before, but now, as she spent more time with Cade, that fear began to dissolve. There was a day just a week after she had arrived when Cade sat with her at the small, wooden table. They had been eating in silence, the only sounds the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft clink of metal on wood. It was a comfortable silence, one that neither of them seemed inclined to break. But then, Cade set his bowl down, his expression more serious than usual. He turned to her, his gaze steady and kind. "Vera," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she felt that old pang of fear, the one that told her people like her always ended up abandoned or hurt. He must have seen the flicker of concern in her eyes, because his voice softened further. "It's about the world outside," he continued. "I don't want to pretend that things are simple here. You've been safe in this house, but that won't last forever. There's always danger. The Ziltra, you're not the only one. People know. They won't forget." Vera's heart clenched at his words. She had known, of course. There were always those who hunted the last of her kind. She had learned that the hard way, running from city to city, never staying too long in one place, always fearful of the next attack. Cade's eyes softened, and he leaned forward. "But you don't have to face that alone," he added, his voice low. "I won't let them hurt you." The sincerity in his words reached deep into Vera's chest. It was not just the comfort of his voice but the raw, unflinching certainty in his eyes that made her believe him. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future, a life beyond this small, humble home. "You don't have to protect me," she said quietly, her voice fragile. "I don't belong here. I'm just a shadow of what was, of what we used to be." Cade shook his head firmly. "You are not a shadow. You're a person. You belong here. And as long as I'm here, no one will take you away. Not while I'm still breathing." Her heart swelled, and she felt the truth of his words seep into her very bones. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she believed it might hold something good. She wasn't sure where they would go from here, but there was no longer a fear of being lost. Cade had given her more than shelter. He had given her the strength to think beyond the fight for survival. He had shown her the possibility of something better. And for the first time in her life, Vera felt the seed of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long: hope. As days turned to weeks, Vera's trust in Cade grew deeper, and the once muted spark of hope within her began to burn brighter. She spent her time learning new things, small chores around the house, organizing tools, mending clothes, and even trying her hand at preparing the meals Cade made with such care. Her body grew stronger, her limbs less stiff, and her mind began to settle into the quiet rhythm of a life that had always felt just out of reach. She had once been a child lost in a world that had no place for her, but now she was beginning to realize that she was more than that. She had a place here. In Cade's small home, in his life, she had found a refuge, and more than that, a purpose. But the outside world, the cold, indifferent city of Zavith, still loomed beyond their modest doorstep. Despite the shelter that Cade had provided, there was no escaping the reality that Vera was not the only Ziltra left in the galaxy. Others hunted her kind. Others feared the remnants of a species that had once been powerful. They would not forget. It was a harsh truth, but one Vera couldn't ignore. It gnawed at her, pulling her thoughts into dark places, reminding her that safety could never be permanent. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the horizon and the stars began to twinkle above, Cade and Vera sat together outside the house. The cool night air ruffled her short hair, and the stars above sparkled in their usual, indifferent brilliance. Vera had become accustomed to the silence, the peacefulness that surrounded them here, but tonight, a shadow lingered in her heart, refusing to be shaken. She could sense that Cade felt it too, the weight of something unsaid hanging between them. "Cade," she began, her voice quiet, unsure of how to frame the question that had been on her mind for days. She took a deep breath, then asked, Do you think I'll always be safe here? That I can stay here with you forever?" Cade didn't immediately answer. Instead, he stared up at the stars for a long moment, his face unreadable. Vera couldn't tell if he was weighing his words or if he was simply lost in his own thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with a sadness she hadn't heard before. "No one can promise forever," he said softly. "The world outside is too uncertain. It's too big, too cruel. But I can promise you this. I will do everything I can to protect you. As long as you want to stay here, as long as you need me, you will be safe. I can't change the galaxy, but I can make this small corner of it your home." Tears welled up in Vera's eyes, though she tried to hide them, blinking them away quickly. His words were the exact ones she had needed to hear, but had been too afraid to ask for. No promises, no fairy tales. But there was a truth in his words that resonated deeply with her, a quiet, steadfast loyalty to a cause greater than just survival. For the first time, Vera smiled, not because she was naive enough to think that everything would be easy, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt that maybe things didn't have to be perfect to be worth fighting for. "I won't leave," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not yet. Not unless I have to. But I'll be ready when it's time." Cade nodded, his lips curling into a faint, approving smile. "Then we'll take it one day at a time," he said. Chapter 4, A Future Unwritten. Months passed, and life in the small, humble home settled into something resembling a routine. The outside world still lingered, pressing against the edges of their quiet existence, but Cade and Vera learned to live with it, carving out moments of peace in a galaxy that was anything but. Every day brought new lessons, new challenges, but also new joys. Vera found herself growing stronger, more confident, and even learning things she never thought possible. She had been a creature of survival, a child whose entire existence had been a struggle against the odds. But now, she was starting to understand the deeper meaning of what it meant to truly live. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Vera resting her head on Cade's shoulder, as the flames crackled and popped in the quiet of the night. They didn't speak often during those moments, but the silence between them had taken on a new kind of meaning. It was not the silence of isolation, but the comfortable silence of two people who had shared their worlds, their fears, and their hopes with one another. Then came the day, as it always does in stories of survival and hope, when the world outside finally came calling. Vera had been in the garden, tending to the small patch of plants Cade had managed to grow in the fertile soil around their home, when she heard the unmistakable sound of engines large, heavy, and closing in. She froze, her heart pounding as she turned toward the sound. Cade had heard it too, and his face immediately darkened. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. Vera's stomach dropped. The city had never forgotten. She had always known that this moment would come, but she hadn't been prepared for it to happen so suddenly. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice shaking with fear. "Hunters," Cade said simply. "They've been tracking the last of the Ziltra for months. It's only a matter of time before they find you." Vera's chest tightened as she realized the gravity of their situation. She had never been someone to run, but now, for the first time, she considered it. Cade stood, his face set in determined lines. "We don't run, Vera. Not anymore. You've been living in hiding long enough. It's time to make sure they know we're not afraid." Together, they prepared, grabbing what little they could carry, hiding away precious things, and bracing for what was to come. As the heavy footsteps drew closer, Cade turned to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "If we have to fight," he said quietly, "we fight together." Vera nodded, her heart racing. She had never known a life of battle, of war. But in this moment, with the threat of extinction looming over her, she understood. She was no longer a child on the run. She was a person with something to protect, a home, a future, and someone who would fight beside her, no matter the odds. The door creaked open, and the dark shapes of their would-be captors emerged from the shadows, but Vera was no longer afraid. With Cade by her side, she was ready. As they stepped forward into the unknown, Vera felt a surge of power, unseen, unspoken, but undeniable. She had found a place in the universe, a purpose greater than mere survival. And though the future was uncertain, she no longer felt alone. In Cade's eyes, she saw the reflection of a new beginning, one that belonged to her. The Ziltra might have been lost to the galaxy, but in that moment, Vera knew she was more than just the last of her kind. She was alive, and that, in itself, was worth fighting for.